growing up in St. John's, I had a friend, a great drummer named Rich Burl. He's still a great drummer, and we lived on the same street. And he was a really serious drummer, and we could hear him all over the neighborhood all the time, you know. And I'd go over to his house, and I'd listen to what he's listening to while he's jamming along to Led Zeppelin and Trooper or whatever it was he was into, whatever was on the radio. And so I was actually, his enthusiasm interested me, but I didn't have any direction. I didn't, you know, my parents borrowed a drum set and I got into it too, but it kind of floundered, and I was focused on other things. This was sort of like junior high age stuff. But then for some reason in high school, which I guess is kind of late, but I got sort of back into it again, and back into music. And then I went back to my friend Rich and asked him about this person he's been studying with, which is a fellow named Don Wary, who moved to Newfoundland in like 73, I think, from Toronto. He played for years in the Toronto Symphony, and has been involved in all kinds of musical projects in his life. And I knew a little bit about him because someone told me he had started this festival I keep hearing about called the Sound Symposium, which happens every 2 years. And so I went over and met him and started getting some lessons, and I was really scared because he only had one eye and a big patch on his eye, and he had a sign in his studio that said the floggings will continue until morale improves. So I thought, well, I don't know, we'll see what happens. But it was then that I realized I had a real mentor. I think what he taught me in terms of music was he taught me how to listen. It was very focused on sound and listening and improvisation. But there was a balance with him too. It wasn't, nothing was ever loosey-goosey. Like things were free, but when it came to practicing and studying and aiming for quality and integrity in what you're doing, he was also a taskmaster in the best kind of way. So he didn't teach. He didn't really teach technique per se, but he sort of taught you to teach yourself a little bit, or he opened up doors for you that way. And of course, this is in a time when all your information is from your teacher. Like there's no YouTube, and at least in St. John's, there's not a lot of groups coming through town where you could go latch on to the musicians. So you got everything from this one person. And luckily, it was this one person who had an incredible knowledge and had connections all over the planet with other musicians. Instrument building was an interest of mine as a student, an undergrad student, studying with when I was studying with Don Wary. And interestingly, I kind of thought that that's what all percussionists did, was build stuff, and a lot do. And it wasn't until later when I, moved out of Newfoundland and studied elsewhere, and then moved to Toronto and did other things, that I realized that not everybody necessarily has that interest or was ever exposed to that world. Figured out how to make marimba bars out of maple and built this little 4.5 octave, I guess not that little, marimba out of maple. Still have it. It's a great practice marimba. It doesn't have any resonators under it, so you can stack all your beer bottles, and it's great for apartments, you know. It was a sound symposium actually, and this Brazilian group Wakchi came from Belo Horizonte, and they had all these instruments, and they wrote, actually one guy in particular, Marco, wrote all the music and designed and built all the instruments. And these instruments were like glass marimbas, which really freaked me out. I couldn't believe the sound of it. And then the PVC pipe tube instruments, like pre-stomp, stamping with your flip-flops kind of instruments. And I just fell in love with the sound of it. It wasn't the fact that, it's something no one else is doing. It was interesting in that way, but just the sound of this glass and the sound of these PVC tubes, and then the sound of these amazing string instruments and reed instruments that they built, and then the music they made from it. Like they made a really convincing case for building instruments, because they also composed beautiful music for it that would really draw you into it. It seems like to me also one of the fundamental aspects of instrument building has been trying to do things cheaply as possible. You're not interested in spending a lot of money. It's much more satisfying to not spend a lot of money and create something beautiful. When I started teaching, I've always, as a student going through, sometimes you're often teaching lessons or teaching young kids or making some money at a music store and teaching and so on. And, I always just tried to do what I learned and had mixed results, because you have people coming in who are half serious and so on. But when I started teaching at the university here in St. John's, that really opened up my mind, because it seems obvious, but it was the first time that I really realized that not everybody comes into, say, a university music program from the same motivation or from the same direction as I did, or for the same reasons that I studied. I had a great process, for technical things, and it really, I got confused when I wasn't getting the results I expected, So that took a couple of years to sort of get my head around all that, and so that really helped me as a teacher, just to relate better to people, I think, and to listen more to what's happening in front of me, instead of pulling out my solutions and waiting until they work. I think percussionists tend to be more open-minded, and maybe it's because as they've studied their instrument, they've seen the multiple ways that their instrument is used in many cultures, and there's this sort of less rules, less of a regiment in music making in your psyche, and so I think that's probably the most common thread that I've seen. when I compose, I think the improviser in me is always present, because I don't think I've ever taken any kind of a real planned approach or any sort of structure, like highly structured or mathematical approach to what I'm doing in the form of something that I write. So often it's an idea and then improvising and jamming it and figuring out where it's going. But I think improvising is always present when I'm doing that. And in fact, I think the improvisation is a really great way to become a composer. I really do enjoy it all, and I've always resisted the need to specialize in something. And I think it served me well in the situation where I've ended up from a teaching point of view, and that I teach at a school that's small enough that it can't afford to hire a bunch of specialists. So this sort of jack of all trades mentality has been good for me. And then actually some of my favorite playing is in the pit of a musical or an opera, where you get to put all these skill sets together. I've got to figure out setups. I've got to build something. Sometimes I have to build an instrument to make it work, and I have to do all these crazy things. And you can't just show up and play. You've got all these other considerations, logistical things. You have to use your brain in different ways, and I find that sometimes I find that just as satisfying an accomplishment as playing a beautiful marimba solo on the stage.